Hello, welcome to today's live on frozen shoulder. I'll wait for a few people to come in and then we will get going. Hi Ellie. Thank you for joining me tonight. I know it's a bit later in the evening. I've had a very busy day with patients and helping people, and my last one just left 10 minutes ago, so ready to jump on here. A few people have joined now, so we may as well get going, and if anyone's missed the start, they can always watch it on catch up. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can't, let me know. Normally I have my headphones in, but it's quite crackly last time when I listened to it back, so I thought I'll just project my voice and not use my headphones this time. So today we are looking at frozen shoulder. So we're going to go through what is frozen shoulder, what are the risk factors, what are some facts about frozen shoulder, and what is the management of it as well for those that do have it, because it can be really debilitating for those that suffer from frozen shoulder. So frozen shoulder is essentially an inflammatory condition and it causes fibrosis of the shoulder joint capsule. So fibrosis is basically thickening and scarring of connective tissue, and that normally happens as a result of injury. What's really interesting with frozen shoulder though is we're not always entirely sure where it's come from. I'm just going to put my phone on silent. There you go. Sorry. So yeah, we're not always entirely sure where it's come from. We know that there is a link between having had an injury and then developing frozen shoulder, but it's not that everyone that's got frozen shoulder has had an injury which has caused it. So we are still learning loads more about frozen shoulder. We don't have all of the answers yet, but I'm just going to give you some of the ones that we currently do have today. So with frozen shoulder, what happens is the joint gradually becomes stiffer and we get a significantly reduced range of motion compared to what we would get normally. And typically frozen shoulder does take about 18 to 24 months to fully resolve, which is obviously a really long time. And for those suffering with frozen shoulder, you're wanting answers, you don't want to have an injury that takes this long, and it can be really confusing and difficult when you've had this injury come on and you're not actually aware of anything specifically that you've done, you've not had any injuries or issues there before. So it is harder for people in that sense as well. Frozen shoulder is more common in women, and approximately 70% of individuals who have frozen shoulder are females. So 70% of people that have it are women, which is crazy. And what's interesting as well is that it happens with individuals between the ages of kind of 35 and 65, with an occurrence rate of around 2 to 5% in general population. So if you look at the population as a whole, between 2 and 5% of those people will typically go on at some point to develop frozen shoulder. And what I find interesting is we obviously don't know necessarily why people get frozen shoulder, and we're not sure why they get it in that kind of middle age sort of bracket and why it's females, but I wonder if there is maybe a link there with menopause, reduction in estrogen levels and that kind of thing that potentially causes more females to have frozen shoulder at that time in their lives. But that is something that is still being researched. For those that are diabetic, what's interesting is that 20% of people that have diabetes will also go on to have frozen shoulder as well, which again is a really high percentage. And that and also people that have had frozen shoulder already, you're 5 to 34% more likely to have it in the contralateral shoulder, so the other shoulder, at some point if you've previously had it in one shoulder. So the thought of having an injury that lasts 18 to 24 months twice is obviously awful. When we're looking at our risk factors, obviously I mentioned diabetes, so that is one of our risk factors. You are more likely to develop frozen shoulder if you have got diabetes. If you've had a stroke, that's another really common one too, because often our joints do get quite stiff after a stroke because we're not able to move them as well as we would normally. Often people get a lot of spasticity, and we see kind of this contracture pattern in the upper limbs after a stroke as well. Thyroid disorders, again, and actually that's kind of linked to diabetes because it's sort of under the autoimmune category as well. And previous shoulder injury, like I said, that does put you at slightly more risk of then developing frozen shoulder if you have had an injury before, but the two aren't intrinsically linked. Having Parkinson's, which is another interesting one, there does appear to be a link there. Again, we're not entirely sure why that is. Those with Parkinson's do tend to have quite a high tone, or what we call high tone. They have often quite bad spastic catches, which is where we sort of look at how quickly we can move them from extension into flexion of a limb. And often if you've got a spastic catch, it kind of gets stuck and gradually comes under like that. So that could well be that we end up with kind of more fibrosis and contractures as a result of that. And those that have complex regional pain syndrome, which is kind of similar to ME and fibromyalgia, there is a link there, with it being a risk factor to then developing frozen shoulder later on. So pathology, patients tend to have a small joint with loss of axillary fold. So that means sort of loss of the fold sort of around the armpit here, and quite a tight anterior capsule. So that's just tightness around this part of the shoulder. And often as well, we see sort of mild to moderate synovitis. So synovitis is just sort of inflammation, swelling, pain, warmth, all that kind of thing in that area of the synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane is just like a kind of thin sheet of connective tissue that kind of goes over the joint basically. But we don't actually tend to see adhesions like we would kind of expect with fibrosis, but we do tend to see that kind of thing. The other thing that we notice as well is contracture of the rotator cuff as well. We often see that in frozen shoulder patients, and that massively contributes to that decrease in range of motion that we typically see with people that have frozen shoulder. And with the rotator cuff, if you watch some of our other videos where we mention it a little bit more, we have 4 muscles that make up our rotator cuff. And essentially what they're there to do, not only do they help with our actual movement in certain directions, but they're also there for stability of the shoulder. And if you kind of pick your arm up and say I hold it in this position here, all of my rotator cuff muscles actually work to keep my shoulder in that position and to keep it stable, and also to keep the pressure of the shoulder correct as well. So if we're getting contracture in those muscles, then that can later on down the line, obviously that does lead to frozen shoulder, but that can later on down the line cause reduction in mobility as well, which causes those problems. There is kind of continued disagreement about whether the underlying pathology is an inflammatory condition or whether it's a fibrosis condition or actually an oligoneurodystrophic condition, which is a long word, but basically just a form of regional complex pain syndrome without any demonstrable nerve lesion. So no actual nerve damage, but a complex pain region potentially. So these are all the avenues that are currently being explored for frozen shoulder that we are still learning more about. So now we want to have a look at the stages of frozen shoulder, of which we have 3. So we have got the freezing stage, we have got the frozen stage, and we have got the thawing stage. So in your freezing stage, this is kind of the acute phase. This is when it's really painful and we get a gradual onset of shoulder pain, even when at rest, and often quite sharp pains in extreme ranges of motion as well. So typically those that have frozen shoulder, initially when it's freezing, it might just be that end range, like, oh, that's really sharp and it's really painful. They'll often notice pain at night as well, with sleep being interrupted. And sleep can be interrupted for sort of 2 to 9 months, quite commonly right at the start of frozen shoulder. And part of the management that we'll go on to later as well is that kind of sleep management around frozen shoulder as well. Our next stage, which is our frozen stage, pain starts to subside, but we get a progressive loss of glenohumeral joint, so that's our shoulder joint, motion in the capsule, and the pain is apparent kind of throughout movement and at extremes of movement as well. And this phase tends to go for kind of 4 months until about 12 months. And with this, what people tend to notice is actually it's not as painful, but their movement is worse. So in some ways it's kind of more debilitating. And then we've got our thawing stage. This is where it's kind of all resolving as well. And this is kind of spontaneous, progressive improvement in our functional range. So we're able to get more range of motion, which can last anywhere from kind of 5 to 24 months, depending on whereabouts in the cycle you're kind of at. And some studies actually say that maybe this is just a self-limiting condition. It may last up to 3 years. It might not last as long if people are able to push through these stages a little bit quicker. But 40% of patients do go on to have kind of persistent issues later on down the line, which then resolve, and about 15% of people go on to have long-term disability as a result of frozen shoulder. But management techniques can help to reduce the longevity of frozen shoulder. They can help reduce the pain and help get your movement back and your strength back quicker. So when we're looking at management of it, from a physio perspective, one of the things that I like to address quite early on, if you're coming to me quite soon after developing frozen shoulder, is your sleep, because typically this is something that people say to me: I can't sleep, my shoulder's keeping me awake at night, my shoulder wakes me up during the night, I can't sleep on it, I can't sleep on the other side. So the first thing is to get a pain management strategy for that, and that could be taking some painkillers before you go to bed, maybe in the night. If you have to take some more, then take some more, because if you're not getting that sleep, then you're not going to get recovery, and if you're not getting recovery, you're not going to get better, and your sleep's going to carry on getting worse. So we kind of need to jump on top of that quickly, because also the less sleep you're getting, if you're not getting 4 hours of continuous uninterrupted sleep, and not including the other 4 hours you should also be getting, but you want to have 4 hours where it's completely uninterrupted, you're not waking up, then you will experience pain differently, you will experience pain worse. So obviously we want to try and prevent that as much as we can by making sure that you are actually getting decent sleep in the night. So that's one of the ways that we manage it, is through pain medication. The other things that we will often do is I often say to people, get your exercise done before you go to bed, because often exercises can make you feel a little bit better. So you've got a bit of reprieve and then you can go to sleep. And other things as well as sort of using heat patches or cold patches. There is no right or wrong when it comes to hot or cold. It really is just preference. If you feel like it feels better after you've had a heat pack on it, do that. If it feels better after you've had an ice pack on it, then do that. It's, there's not a set standard for that. There's also no kind of real set way in the literature to manage frozen shoulder. So there's no set guidelines that say you need to do this, this and this. So physios get quite a lot of kind of freedom over what we want to do with patients that have frozen shoulder. But one of the first things that I want to address is your pain during the day as well. So sometimes I give some isometric exercises, which can be really good for helping reduce pain, because that's one of the reasons that we have them. And they also help to maintain people's strength as well, because I don't want your strength getting worse over this time if I can avoid that. So there's two of the things that we look at. One of the other things is range of motion, because obviously we know that range of motion is obviously getting worse throughout these stages. So we want to try and maintain as much of that as we possibly can. Often we do lots of passive movements, so we're moving your arm and you're kind of maybe assisting us as well. So you can then maintain as much of that kind of normal movement as possible as well. And also a lot of education for patients as well, and reminding them that this is a bit of a process. Unfortunately, you've kind of got to see it through to the end, and eventually it will get better and it will improve, but it is really hard in the meantime. And we obviously want to guide people through that full loading back to injury as well. Back to their lifestyle before, throughout the injury. So as soon as they're going through that thawing stage, it's really important for me to, one, get their sort of shoulder mechanics going so that everything is firing nicely and as it should do, but then to gradually increase the load, because they've not been doing much through that arm for a long time. So it doesn't just mean the arm becomes weak, often the top of your back will become weak, even maybe your lower back might become a bit weak on that side, and obviously then you're opening yourself up to other injuries, and at the elbow, wrist, hand, all of those kind of things. So I will give people exercises to gradually load back up to the position that they were at before, if that makes sense. There are other options as well when it comes to management. People have had, you can do corticosteroid injections, you can have ones where they almost blow saline into the shoulder as well. Again, there isn't set research to show that this definitely does help or doesn't help, but I have had patients that have had things like that done and have said that it has helped them, even if it is temporary, to give them some reprieve. So for people that are really struggling with pain, sometimes that can be a route that we can go down to help improve that for them as well, if that makes sense. So yeah, that is sort of our overview on frozen shoulder, what it is, what are the stages, what are the risk factors and the management. If you've got any questions, now is the time to ask them. And if not, then, and you're watching this later on, you have some questions, then feel free to pop them on here or drop me a message and I will answer as many as I can. Fab. I don't think we've got any questions, but if you have got a frozen shoulder or any other kind of shoulder pain, feel free to message below this video or drop me a message and I will be happy to help you. I hope you have a lovely evening. Bye.